Chapter 1. The Collapse. I collapsed in the kitchen. My son answered and said, "If you can't live alone, go to a nursing home." Hours later, my daughter-in-law wrote on Facebook, "One less, more happiness." From the hospital, I made a call. That week, they received the updated will. But let me start from the beginning, because what happened that Tuesday morning changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. I was making Stephen's favorite banana pancakes when the chest pain hit. Not the sharp, dramatic kind you see in movies, but a crushing weight that spread across my ribs like someone was slowly tightening a belt around my lungs. The mixing bowl slipped from my hands, batter splattering across the linoleum floor I'd mopped just that morning. "Stephen?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The pain was stealing my breath, making each word feel like lifting a boulder. "Stephen, I need help." I could hear him upstairs, probably getting ready for another day at his sales job. The job I'd helped him get through a connection at church after his divorce left him scrambling to rebuild his life.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
Nicole was likely still in bed, as she usually was until noon, claiming her anxiety made mornings difficult. "Stephen," I tried again, louder this time. But my voice cracked. The kitchen seemed to tilt sideways, and I grabbed the counter to steady myself. My wedding ring, loose on my finger now after losing weight these past months, clinked against the granite countertop that Stephen had insisted I install last year. "It's an investment in the house value, Mom," he'd said, though I suspected it was really about impressing Nicole's friends when they came over. The pain intensified, radiating down my left arm now. I knew what this was. At 68, I'd seen enough friends go through this to recognize the signs. My heart was failing me, just like everything else in my life seemed to be doing lately. I managed to make it to the kitchen chair, the same wooden chair where I'd sat every morning for the past 3 years since Richard died. The same chair where I'd eaten countless lonely breakfasts while Stephen and Nicole slept late upstairs in what used to be my master bedroom. I'd given it up willingly when they moved in after Stephen's divorce, thinking it was temporary, thinking I was helping. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was having a heart attack while making breakfast for people who barely acknowledged my existence anymore. "Mom, what's all the noise down there?" Stephen's voice finally came from the top of the stairs, irritated rather than concerned. "Some of us are trying to sleep." "I'm having chest pain," I managed to call back, each word a struggle. "I think I need to go to the hospital." The silence that followed felt eternal. I could hear muffled voices upstairs, Stephen talking to Nicole in those hushed tones they used when discussing me, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be cared for. Finally, footsteps on the stairs. Stephen appeared in the doorway, still in his pajamas, his hair messy from sleep. At 42, he looked older than his years. Stress lines etched around his eyes from the divorce, from the job pressures, from life not turning out the way he'd planned. But there was something else in his expression now, something that made my chest tighten even more than the pain already was. Annoyance. Pure, undisguised annoyance. "Mom, you can't keep doing this," he said, not moving any closer to me. "Every time you feel a little under the weather, you panic and think you're dying." "This is different," I whispered, pressing my hand to my chest. "Stephen, please. I think I'm having a heart attack." He sighed, the same exaggerated sigh he'd given me as a teenager when I'd asked him to clean his room. "Fine, I'll call an ambulance. But Mom, this has to stop. You can't keep living like this, getting worked up over every little thing." As he reached for his phone, Nicole appeared behind him, wearing one of those silk nightgowns that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her blonde hair was perfectly tousled in that way that took an hour to achieve but was supposed to look effortless. She surveyed the scene, taking in the spilled pancake batter, my pale face, Stephen's obvious frustration. "What's happening?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew and wasn't pleased about it. "Mom thinks she's having a heart attack," Stephen said, emphasis on thinks like it was just another one of my imaginary ailments. Nicole's expression shifted slightly, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like calculation in her eyes. "Well, if she can't handle living alone anymore, maybe it's time to consider other options." The words hit me harder than the physical pain. Living alone? I wasn't living alone. I was living with them, in my own house, cooking their meals, cleaning their messes, paying their bills while they treated me like an unwelcome guest. "Let's just get through today first," Stephen said, but I could hear it in his voice. The seed Nicole had just planted taking root. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later. I know because I watched the kitchen clock, each minute feeling like an hour as the pain continued to squeeze my chest. The paramedics were kind, professional, asking questions about my symptoms, my medications, my medical history. They treated me like a person, like someone whose pain mattered. Stephen rode with me to the hospital, but he spent most of the trip on his phone, texting Nicole, calling his work to say he'd be late. I lay on the stretcher, oxygen mask over my face, watching my son treat my medical emergency like an inconvenience in his schedule. At the hospital, after the initial rush of tests and medications, after the cardiologist confirmed that yes, I had indeed suffered a mild heart attack, Stephen sat beside my bed with that same expression of barely contained irritation. "So, what happens now?" he asked, though he was looking at his phone rather than at me. "I'll need to stay a few days for observation," I said quietly. "They want to make sure there's no further damage." Stephen nodded absently, then looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, clinical, like he was looking at a problem rather than his mother. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation. Nicole and I have been discussing it, and honestly, we don't think you should be living alone anymore." "But I'm not living alone," I said, confused. "I'm living with you. That's not working out," he said flatly. "You're too dependent, too needy. Every little thing becomes a crisis. Maybe it's time to look into assisted living, somewhere with medical staff who can handle these kinds of episodes." The words hit me like ice water. After everything I'd done for him, everything I'd sacrificed, he was suggesting I be put away like something broken that could no longer be fixed. "Stephen, I raised you in that house. It's my home." "It's just a house, Mom. And honestly, Nicole's been really stressed having you there. She's dealing with her own anxiety, and having to worry about you all the time isn't helping." "Worry about me? When was the last time either of them had even asked how I was feeling?" That evening, alone in my hospital bed, I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened Facebook on my phone. I rarely used it anymore, mostly just to see pictures of my grandchildren from Stephen's first marriage, the ones who lived with their mother in another state and rarely visited. But tonight, I scrolled through, looking at the lives of people I used to know, the women I'd taught Sunday school with, the neighbors who'd become distant after Richard died, and there, posted just 2 hours ago, was Nicole's status update. "Finally getting some peace and quiet at home. Sometimes life gives you exactly what you need. One less problem to deal with means more happiness for everyone. Blessed, fresh start." The post had 12 likes and several comments from her friends, laughing face emojis and supportive messages about toxic people and putting yourself first. I stared at that screen until my eyes blurred with tears. One less problem. That's what I was to them. Not a mother, not a grandmother, not a woman who had worked 3 jobs to put Stephen through college, who had opened her home and her heart to his new family. Just a problem to be eliminated. But as I lay there in that sterile hospital bed, something else began to grow alongside the hurt, something harder and clearer than the pain in my chest. I pulled up my contact list and found the number I was looking for. "Morrison and Associates Law Firm," the answering service said. "This is Charlotte Williams," I said, my voice steady for the first time all day. "I need to speak with Mr. Morrison about updating my will. It's urgent." The next morning, Stephen arrived with coffee and a folder full of brochures for assisted living facilities. He spread them out on my bedside table like a real estate agent presenting options to a client. "I've done some research," he said, not meeting my eyes. "There are some really nice places, Mom. Places where you'd have people around all the time. Activities, meals prepared for you." I looked at the glossy photos of smiling elderly people in pristine facilities, all looking suspiciously happy to be warehoused away from their families. "And what about the house?" "Well, Nicole and I would take care of it. Maybe rent it out to help pay for your care. It would work out better for everyone. Everyone except me, apparently." But I just nodded and told him I'd think about it. I didn't mention the phone call I'd made or the appointment I'd scheduled for that afternoon with my lawyer. Some conversations were better had in private. Mr. Morrison arrived at the hospital that afternoon with his briefcase and the kind of gentle professionalism that comes from years of dealing with family crises. I'd known him since Richard and I bought our first house 35 years ago, and he'd handled Richard's estate when he passed. He was one of the few people left who remembered me as more than just Stephen's aging mother. "Charlotte, I came as soon as I could," he said, settling into the uncomfortable hospital chair. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been living in a fool's paradise," I said, which wasn't the answer he expected but was the truest thing I could say. As we talked about my current will, about my assets and wishes, I found myself telling him things I'd never said out loud, about how slowly, so slowly I barely noticed, my life had been carved away piece by piece. It started 3 years ago when Stephen's marriage fell apart. Sarah had finally had enough of his drinking, his inability to hold down a job, his tendency to blame everyone else for his problems. The divorce was ugly, expensive, and Stephen came to me desperate and broken. "Just temporarily, Mom," he'd said, standing in my kitchen with 2 suitcases and shame written all over his face. "Just until I get back on my feet. Nicole's place is too small for both of us." Nicole was the rebound relationship that happened too fast and stuck too hard. 10 years younger than Stephen, blonde and beautiful in that high-maintenance way that requires constant attention and expensive upkeep. She'd been working as a receptionist at the dealership where Stephen bought his car, and apparently she saw something in my newly divorced, financially struggling son that I couldn't quite understand. But I wanted Stephen to be happy. After watching him spiral through the divorce, seeing him lose access to his kids from his first marriage, I thought maybe Nicole was exactly what he needed. Someone young and optimistic who could help him start over. "Of course you can stay here," I'd told him. "This is your home." The first changes were small. Nicole couldn't sleep with the grandfather clock chiming every hour, so it went into storage. She was allergic to the flowers I kept on the kitchen table, so those stopped. "The guest room where they slept needed updating," Nicole said. So we painted over the soft yellow Richard and I had chosen for a stark white that made the room feel cold and sterile. "Just until we find our own place," Stephen kept saying. But weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. I didn't mind, not at first. The house had felt too empty after Richard died, too full of memories and echoes. Having young people there, having purpose again, felt good. I cooked their favorite meals, did their laundry, kept the house clean while Stephen looked for better work, and Nicole pursued her real estate license. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being the homeowner and started being the help. It happened so gradually I couldn't pinpoint when the shift occurred. Stephen stopped asking if he could change things and started just doing it. The living room furniture that Richard and I had saved for years to buy was suddenly outdated and needed to go. My kitchen was inefficient and required reorganizing. The master bedroom, where Richard and I had shared 30 years of marriage, became theirs because they needed more space. "You'll be more comfortable in the guest room," Stephen had said, as if he was doing me a favor. "It's quieter back there, better for sleeping." I moved my belongings like an obedient child, telling myself it was temporary, that when they got their own place, everything would go back to normal. But normal kept shifting further away. Nicole's suggestions became rules. I was too loud in the mornings, so I learned to tiptoe around my own kitchen. My television shows were inappropriate for a family home, so I started watching them with headphones. My longtime friends made Nicole uncomfortable, so their visits became less frequent and eventually stopped altogether. "Your mom's friends are kind of gossipy," Nicole would tell Stephen after one of them left. "I don't think they like me very much." And Stephen, wanting to keep peace in his new relationship, would ask me to perhaps not invite them over so often. For Nicole's sake. The financial arrangements were the most insidious part. At first, they offered to pay rent, but I refused. They were family, and family doesn't charge family. But somehow I ended up paying for everything anyway. Groceries that were supposed to be shared became my responsibility because I was particular about brands. Utilities that were supposed to be split became mine because it was easier to just keep them in my name. Stephen's job hunting seemed to involve a lot of expensive networking lunches and updated wardrobes, all of which somehow came out of my savings because it was an investment in our future. Nicole's real estate courses and licensing fees were educational expenses that would benefit the whole family when she started earning commissions. But the commissions never seemed to materialize, and Stephen's better job remained perpetually just around the corner. I found myself living on a smaller and smaller budget in my own home, buying generic groceries while they ate name brands, wearing the same clothes for years while Nicole's wardrobe expanded monthly. When I mentioned maybe cutting back on some expenses, Nicole would get that hurt look in her eyes. "Charlotte, I thought we were family," she'd say, using my first name in that way that sounded intimate but somehow felt diminishing. "I never expected you to keep track of every dollar like we're strangers." And Stephen would look at me with disappointment, as if I were being petty and small-minded, as if wanting to have some control over my own finances was a character flaw. The isolation was even worse than the financial manipulation. Nicole had a gift for making people feel unwelcome without ever saying anything directly confrontational. She would be perfectly pleasant to my face, but somehow my friends always left feeling like they'd intruded on something. My sister Ruth stopped visiting after Nicole made several comments about how old-fashioned our conversations were, how we lived in the past instead of embracing the future. "I just think it's healthy for Stephen to focus on building his new life rather than dwelling on childhood memories," Nicole had said sweetly, as if my presence in my own home was somehow holding my son back from success. The grandchildren from Stephen's first marriage gradually disappeared from our lives too. Nicole felt it was confusing for them to spend time in a house that wasn't really their father's anymore. She suggested that Stephen's relationship with his ex-wife was unhealthy, and that maintaining connections to his old life was preventing him from fully committing to his new one. "Kids are resilient," she'd say when Stephen expressed doubt about missing another weekend with his children. "They'll understand when they're older that their father needed to focus on building a stable future." Stephen's stable future, apparently, required cutting ties with everything and everyone from his past, including, increasingly, me. I became a relic in my own home, a reminder of old loyalties and obligations that Nicole found inconvenient. The breaking point should have been last Christmas when I discovered that Nicole had been telling people I was struggling with dementia and needed constant supervision. I overheard her on the phone with someone, describing how difficult it was to care for Stephen's declining mother, how she was practically a full-time caregiver for someone who couldn't be trusted alone. I confronted her about it, and she turned on the tears immediately. "Charlotte, I'm so sorry if I gave the wrong impression," she sobbed. "I'm just so worried about you. The way you forget conversations, repeat yourself, get confused about dates. I thought maybe you should see a doctor. But I didn't forget conversations, or repeat myself, or get confused about dates. What I did was disagree with Nicole occasionally, or mention plans she preferred I forget, or remember promises that became inconvenient. In Nicole's world, any pushback from me was evidence of cognitive decline. Stephen, of course, believed her completely. His relief at having an explanation for my increasing difficult behavior was visible. It was easier to believe that I was losing my mind than to confront the possibility that his girlfriend was systematically dismantling his relationship with his mother. "Maybe you should see someone, Mom," he'd said gently, as if he were the parent and I were the confused child, just to be safe, just to make sure everything's okay. But I knew everything wasn't okay. I just hadn't realized how far from okay things had gotten until I saw that Facebook post from my hospital bed. One less problem to deal with means more happiness for everyone. That's when I understood that my heart attack wasn't a health crisis to them. It was an opportunity, a chance to finally solve the problem of Charlotte Williams once and for all. Mr. Morrison listened to all of this without interruption, occasionally making notes in his precise handwriting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Charlotte, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer," he said finally. "If Stephen and Nicole weren't your family, if they were strangers who had moved into your home and treated you this way, what would you call it?" I knew the answer, but I'd never let myself think the word before. "Financial abuse. Emotional abuse." He nodded. "The fact that they're family doesn't make it less true." The next morning brought visitors I hadn't expected. My neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, knocked softly on the hospital room door, carrying a small bouquet of daisies from her garden. "Charlotte, dear, I heard about your heart attack from Stephen," she said, settling into the chair beside my bed. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you," I said, touched that she'd come. Mrs. Peterson and I had been neighbors for 15 years, though we'd grown distant since Stephen and Nicole moved in. It was kind of you to visit. She looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with her purse strap. Charlotte, I have to tell you something. I probably should have said something sooner, but I didn't want to interfere in family business. My stomach tightened. What is it? It's about Nicole. She's been telling people in the neighborhood that you're not well. Mentally, I mean. Mrs. Peterson's voice dropped to a whisper. She told the Hendersons that you have Alzheimer's and don't remember conversations. She told Mrs. Chen at the grocery store that you've been having episodes where you don't recognize people. The room seemed to spin slightly. Episodes? What episodes? That's just it, dear. I've never seen you have any episodes. You seem as sharp as ever to me. But Nicole makes it sound like Stephen is some kind of saint for taking care of his sick mother, and that you don't even remember most of what happens from day to day. I felt sick, and not from the heart medication. How long has she been saying these things? Months, maybe longer. I started noticing it when she'd make comments at the mailbox, little things about how hard it was to care for someone who was declining. But then last week she told the mailman that you'd been asking the same questions over and over, forgetting his name even though he's been on this route for 5 years. But I knew Mike, the mailman's name. I knew his wife was pregnant with their second child. I knew he was taking night classes to become a teacher. The idea that Nicole had painted me as someone too confused to remember basic interactions made my chest burn with more than just heart pain. Mrs. Peterson, has anyone else said anything to you about this? She nodded reluctantly. A few of the other neighbors have mentioned how difficult it must be for Stephen. Carol Martinez said Nicole told her you sometimes don't remember cooking and leave burners on. Janet Foster heard that you got lost trying to walk to the corner store and Stephen had to come find you. None of it was true. I hadn't gotten lost, hadn't left burners on, hadn't forgotten conversations or people's names, but Nicole had created an elaborate fiction about my mental decline and spread it throughout the entire neighborhood. The thing is, Mrs. Peterson continued, none of us have actually seen any of these behaviors ourselves. When I run into you at the mailbox or the store, you seem perfectly normal. But Nicole is so convincing, and she seems so devoted to taking care of you. After Mrs. Peterson left, I sat in my hospital bed trying to process the scope of Nicole's deception. She hadn't just isolated me from friends and family. She'd systematically destroyed my reputation in the community, painting me as a burden, a problem, someone who couldn't be trusted to care for herself. My phone rang, and I saw my sister Ruth's name on the screen. We hadn't spoken in months, not since she'd stopped visiting because Nicole made her feel unwelcome. Charlotte, I just heard about your heart attack, Ruth said, her voice tight with worry. Why didn't anyone call me sooner? I didn't know you'd want to be bothered, I said, then immediately regretted the bitter tone. Bothered? Charlotte, you're my sister. Of course I'd want to know if you were in the hospital. There was a pause. Has Nicole been telling people I don't care about you? The question caught me off guard. Why would you ask that? Because when I called the house yesterday to check on you, she told me you'd been asking why I never visit anymore, like you'd forgotten that I stopped coming because you told me I wasn't welcome. My hands started shaking. Ruth, I never told you that you weren't welcome. I've missed you terribly. I know that now, Ruth said softly. But Nicole made it sound like you'd been complaining about my visits, saying I was too loud and disruptive. She said you'd asked her to discourage me from coming over because it upset your routine. Another lie. Another piece of my life that Nicole had manipulated and twisted to serve her own purposes. Ruth, I need to tell you something, I said. And I found myself repeating the same story I'd told Mr. Morrison the day before, about the gradual erosion of my autonomy, the financial manipulation, the systematic isolation. When I finished, Ruth was quiet for a long time. Charlotte, I had no idea. I knew something felt off about Nicole, but Stephen seemed so happy, and you seemed to be going along with everything. I was trying to keep the peace. I thought if I just adapted, if I made myself smaller and less troublesome, things would work out. You made yourself invisible, Ruth said bluntly, and they took advantage of that. That afternoon, Ruth arrived at the hospital with an angry expression and a folder full of printed Facebook posts. She spread them out on my bed table like evidence at a trial. I did some digging after we talked, she said. Look at this. The posts went back over a year. Nicole documenting her life as a caregiver to Stephen's ailing mother. Photos of herself looking exhausted and overwhelmed, accompanied by captions about the challenges of caring for someone with memory issues and behavioral problems. One post from 6 months ago showed Nicole in what looked like our kitchen, surrounded by cleaning supplies, with the caption, "Another day of deep cleaning after Mom had one of her confused episodes." It's exhausting, but Stephen and I are committed to keeping her safe and comfortable at home as long as possible. Caregiver life. Family first. Another post from just last month showed Nicole at what appeared to be a support group meeting. So grateful for the caregiver support group at St. Mary's. It helps to talk to other people dealing with elderly family members who are struggling with cognitive decline. Some days are harder than others, but love keeps us going. Alzheimer's awareness. Never give up. I stared at the posts in disbelief. Nicole had created an entire online persona as my devoted caregiver, documenting struggles with a version of me that didn't exist. She joined support groups for Alzheimer's caregivers, participated in awareness campaigns, even started a blog about the challenges of caring for someone with dementia. She's been monetizing this, Ruth said, showing me another screen. Look, she's got affiliate links to medical equipment, supplements, books about dementia care. She's making money off of pretending to take care of you. The blog was called Grace Under Pressure, A Daughter's Journey with Alzheimer's. Nicole had written dozens of posts about Mom's decline, about good days and bad days, about the heartbreak of watching someone you love disappear piece by piece. One entry from last week, posted while I was in the hospital, described finding me collapsed in the kitchen. This morning was one of our worst days yet. Mom became confused and agitated while trying to cook, and I found her on the floor, disoriented and frightened. The paramedics said it might have been a panic attack brought on by her confusion, but I know it was her heart breaking from the stress of losing herself. Some days, I don't know if I'm strong enough for this journey. Even my heart attack had become content for her fabricated narrative. There's more, Ruth said grimly. I called cousin Margaret in Phoenix. Nicole contacted her last month asking for advice about memory care facilities. She told Margaret that you'd been getting violent and paranoid, that it wasn't safe for you to be around normal people anymore. My chest tightened again. But this time it wasn't my heart condition, it was pure rage. She told Margaret that Stephen was in denial about how bad your condition had gotten, that he couldn't bear to face the reality of putting you in a facility. She painted herself as the only rational one, the one trying to make the hard decisions that Stephen was too emotional to make. I thought about all the assisted living brochures Stephen had brought to the hospital, how readily he'd accepted the idea that I needed institutional care. Nicole had been preparing him for months, maybe years, building the case that I was too far gone to live independently. There's something else, Ruth said, pulling out her phone. I found Nicole on several dating apps. My blood went cold. What? Ruth showed me the profiles. Nicole using photos that were clearly recent, describing herself as single and recently out of a difficult caregiving situation, looking for someone who understood that family comes first. Her profile mentioned being devoted to caring for her boyfriend's elderly mother until recently, when professional care became necessary. Stephen doesn't know? I whispered. I don't think so. She's been very careful about this. But Charlotte, she's already preparing for her exit strategy. The nursing home push, the online dating profiles, even the blog that makes her look like a martyr who sacrificed years of her life for your care. She's building a narrative that lets her walk away looking like a saint. I closed my eyes, trying to process the full scope of Nicole's deception. She hadn't just stolen my money and my autonomy. She'd stolen my identity, my reputation, my relationships with people who cared about me. She'd turned me into a fictional character in her elaborate performance as the devoted caregiver. What are you going to do? Ruth asked. I opened my eyes and looked at my sister, really looked at her, for the first time in months without Nicole's influence coloring my perception. I'm going to disappear, I said quietly, just like she wants me to, but not the way she planned. The financial meeting with Mr. Morrison the next day revealed truths that even I had forgotten in the fog of the past 3 years. We sat in the hospital's small conference room, papers spread across the table like pieces of a puzzle I was finally ready to solve. Charlotte, I need you to understand the full scope of what you own, Mr. Morrison said, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed document after document. When Richard passed, you inherited more than just the house. I knew about the house, of course. The modest two-story home that Richard and I had bought in 1987, now worth nearly $400,000 in today's market. But as Mr. Morrison walked me through the portfolio, I realized how much I'd let Stephen and Nicole's financial neediness distract me from my own security. The life insurance payout was substantial, he continued. $250,000, which you wisely invested in a mix of bonds and conservative mutual funds. That money has been growing steadily for 3 years. I'd forgotten about the investments. After Richard died, I'd been so overwhelmed with grief and the practical matters of settling his estate that I'd simply signed whatever papers Mr. Morrison put in front of me and tried not to think about money at all. Then there's Richard's pension fund, which you rolled into an IRA, another $180,000, and the savings accounts you shared, which you never touched. He looked up at me over his glasses. Charlotte, even with the money you've been spending on Stephen and Nicole over the past 3 years, you're worth nearly $700,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $700,000. While I'd been buying generic groceries and wearing the same clothes for years, while I'd been worrying about the electric bill and rationing my medication to save money, I'd been sitting on a small fortune. But I've been struggling, I said weakly. I've been living paycheck to paycheck on my Social Security. Because you've been supporting 3 adults on 1 Social Security check, Mr. Morrison said gently. Your monthly expenses for the household have been running close to $4,000, while your Social Security is only $1,800. You've been making up the difference by unconsciously restricting your own spending rather than touching your investments. I thought about all the times I'd chosen the cheapest option at the grocery store while Nicole filled the cart with organic produce and expensive wine. All the times I'd put off dental appointments or delayed filling prescriptions while Stephen bought new clothes for job interviews that never seemed to pan out. Stephen doesn't know about the investments? I asked. Unless you told him no. The accounts are in your name only, and the statements go to this office per your instructions after Richard died. You said you didn't want to deal with financial paperwork while you were grieving. Another puzzle piece clicked into place. Stephen and Nicole had been operating under the assumption that I was financially vulnerable, dependent on their goodwill and grateful for their presence in my home. They'd seen my frugal spending habits and assumed I was barely scraping by, when in reality I was just unconsciously protecting assets I'd forgotten I had. There's something else, Mr. Morrison said, pulling out another folder. I've been reviewing your household expenses over the past 3 years, and I think you should see this breakdown. The numbers were staggering. $47,000 in grocery bills, with Stephen and Nicole consuming the majority of the food. $22,000 in utilities, most of which went to support their energy consumption. $18,000 in clothing and personal items, none of which were mine. $15,000 in dining out, entertainment, and what appeared to be Nicole's business expenses for her real estate ventures that never materialized. In total, you've subsidized their lifestyle to the tune of approximately $130,000 over 3 years, Mr. Morrison said. That's more than most people make in salary. I stared at the breakdown, feeling sick. While Nicole had been portraying herself online as a selfless caregiver, she'd been living a lifestyle I was funding without even realizing it. The car payments are interesting too, Mr. Morrison continued. Stephen's truck and Nicole's SUV are both financed through loans that list your house as collateral. If they default on the payments, you could lose your home. They used my house as collateral without telling me. You signed the papers, but I suspect you weren't told what they were for. Looking at the dates, this was about 6 months after Richard died, when you were still very much in grief. Nicole brought the papers to you, according to my records, and said they were refinancing documents to get you a better interest rate on your mortgage. I remembered that day vaguely. Nicole had been so sweet, so concerned about helping me navigate the financial complexities of widowhood. She'd sat with me at the kitchen table, pointing to signature lines and explaining in her patient voice that this was all routine paperwork to protect my interests. So if Stephen and Nicole decide to stop making car payments, I asked. The bank can force you to pay or take your house. You're liable for roughly $60,000 in auto loans you probably don't even know you guaranteed. The web of financial manipulation was even more complex than I'd imagined. Not only had they been draining my resources, they'd positioned themselves to potentially take my home, even if I tried to remove them from my life. Mr. Morrison, I want to understand something, I said slowly. If I weren't living with Stephen and Nicole, if I were just managing my own expenses, what would my financial situation look like? He pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. Your Social Security covers basic living expenses for one person. Your investment returns, if properly managed, could provide another $15,000 to $20,000 per year in income. You'd be quite comfortable, Charlotte. Not wealthy, but secure. Comfortable. The word felt foreign. I hadn't felt comfortable in 3 years. I want to make some changes to my will, I said. And I want to understand my options for dealing with the car loans and the house situation. We spent the next hour going through scenarios. Mr. Morrison explained that I could demand Stephen and Nicole either pay off the car loans immediately or surrender the vehicles. I could ask them to leave my home with 30 days' notice. I could stop subsidizing their lifestyle and use my resources to actually enjoy my remaining years. But Charlotte, he said carefully, these are nuclear options. Once you start this process, your relationship with Stephen will probably never be the same. I thought about Stephen as a little boy, how he used to crawl into bed with Richard and me on Sunday mornings, how proud I'd been at his high school graduation, how I'd cried tears of joy at his first wedding. Then I thought about the man who had looked at me in the hospital with cold calculation and suggested I be warehoused in assisted living. Mr. Morrison, I don't think my relationship with Stephen has existed for some time now. I've just been too afraid to admit it. The new will was surprisingly simple to construct. Mr. Morrison walked me through each decision, making sure I understood the implications. The house would go to Ruth, along with enough money to maintain it. She'd always loved that house, and unlike Stephen, she appreciated what it represented, a lifetime of careful saving and modest dreams fulfilled. The bulk of my investments would be divided among the people who had shown me genuine care and kindness over the past 3 years. Mrs. Peterson, who had visited me in the hospital and tried to warn me about Nicole's lies. Mike, the mailman, who always took time to ask about my health and share stories about his growing family. Janet Chen at the grocery store, who had watched Nicole spread rumors about my mental state, but had always treated me with dignity and respect. Dr. Williams, my primary care physician, who had listened patiently to my concerns and never made me feel like a hypochondriac. The nurse who had taken care of me during my hospital stay, who had held my hand during the scary moments when I thought I might be dying alone. Even the young man who delivered my prescriptions, who always waited patiently while I counted out exact change, who had never once made me feel embarrassed about my careful spending. These are all modest bequests, I told Mr. Morrison. 10,000 here, 15,000 there. Not enough to change their lives dramatically, but enough to show them that their kindness mattered. For Stephen, I was leaving something too, the hospital bill from my heart attack. Not out of cruelty, but as a symbol of what our relationship had become. A medical emergency that he'd treated as an inconvenience. A financial burden rather than a human crisis. Are you sure about this, Charlotte? Mr. Morrison asked as I signed the final documents. I thought about Nicole's Facebook post, about Stephen's casual suggestion that I belonged in a nursing home, about the 3 years of my life I'd lost trying to make myself small enough to deserve their tolerance. I've never been more sure of anything. That evening, I had a visitor I wasn't expecting. Stephen arrived carrying flowers from the hospital gift shop and wearing an expression of practiced concern. "Mom, how are you feeling today?" he asked, settling into the chair beside my bed. "The nurses said you've been having meetings all day. I hope you're not overtiring yourself." I wondered if the nurses had mentioned that one of those meetings was with my lawyer, but I doubted it. Medical privacy was something Stephen had never bothered to understand. "I'm feeling much clearer," I said, which was true in ways he couldn't imagine. "That's good to hear. Nicole and I have been talking, and we think it might be good for you to stay in the hospital a few extra days, just to make sure you're really stable before coming home. Home. As if my own house were a favor they were granting me. Actually, Stephen, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about assisted living." His face brightened with what looked like relief. "Really? I think that could be a good option, Mom. There are some really nice places. Before we go down that road, I want to understand something about our finances. Mr. Morrison came by today to review some paperwork. Stephen's expression flickered just slightly. Oh? What kind of paperwork? He mentioned that you and Nicole used the house as collateral for your car loans. I don't remember agreeing to that. The flicker became a definite shift. Stephen's easy smile tightened around the edges. Mom, you were pretty confused after Dad died. Nicole helped you with a lot of financial stuff that you weren't really able to handle on your own. There it was again, the suggestion that I'd been incompetent, unreliable, in need of their management. But this time, instead of making me doubt myself, it made me angry. I see. And how much exactly do I owe on your vehicles? Mom, why are you asking about this stuff? It's all handled. You don't need to worry about it. Humor me. Stephen shifted uncomfortably. I don't know the exact amounts off the top of my head. $60,000, I said quietly. I'm responsible for $60,000 in car loans for vehicles I don't drive. Loans I didn't knowingly agree to. Mom, we can discuss this when you're feeling better. Right now, you should focus on recovering. I looked at my son. This man I'd raised and loved and supported, who was now trying to manage me like a problem employee who'd asked uncomfortable questions at a board meeting. I am feeling better, Stephen. In fact, I'm feeling better than I have in 3 years. I was discharged from the hospital on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after my heart attack. Stephen arrived to pick me up with Nicole beside him, both wearing expressions of forced cheerfulness that didn't quite reach their eyes. Ready to come home, Mom? Stephen asked, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure where home was supposed to be anymore. More than ready, I said, which was the truth, though not in the way he understood it. The drive back to the house was quiet. Nicole made small talk about the weather and asked politely about my medication schedule, playing the role of the concerned caregiver for anyone who might be listening. But I caught her eyes in the rearview mirror once, and the calculation I saw there confirmed everything I needed to know about her true intentions. When we pulled into the driveway of the house where I'd lived for 35 years, I felt like I was seeing it through different eyes. The garden Richard and I had planted together looked overgrown and neglected. The front porch where we used to sit in the evenings had been turned into storage space for Nicole's exercise equipment and Stephen's golf clubs. I thought you might want to rest today, Nicole said as we walked to the front door. I made up the guest room with fresh sheets. The guest room. In my own house, I was a guest. Actually, I'd like to spend some time in my bedroom, I said. I've missed sleeping in my own space. Stephen and Nicole exchanged a look. Mom, we talked about this in the hospital, Stephen said carefully. Nicole and I really need the master bedroom. It's better suited for a couple, and you'll be more comfortable in the smaller room. For now, I said agreeably. Of course, but there wouldn't be a later, not the way they imagined. Over the next 3 days, I played the role they expected. I was quiet, compliant, seemingly resigned to whatever arrangement they preferred. I took my medication on schedule, ate the meals Nicole prepared, and spent most of my time in the guest room watching television or reading. What they didn't see were the phone calls I made while they were out. The real estate agent who specialized in coastal properties. The moving company that offered full-service packing and storage. The mail forwarding service that would handle my address change without leaving a paper trail. Ruth came by on Saturday afternoon, ostensibly to check on my recovery, but really to help me finalize the plans we'd been making. Nicole was out getting her nails done, and Stephen was at a job interview that would probably go nowhere, like all the others. Are you sure about this? Ruth asked as we sat in my kitchen, speaking in low voices even though we were alone. I've never been more sure of anything, I said. Ruth, I've been dead for 3 years. I just didn't realize it until I actually almost died. She nodded, understanding what I meant. The house in Ocean City is perfect. 2 bedrooms, walking distance to the beach, and the owner is flexible about a quick closing. And it's far enough away that they won't just show up unexpectedly. 3 hours by car, close enough that you're not completely isolated, but far enough that they'll have to make a real effort to visit. Ruth paused. If they even try. That was the question that haunted me most. Once Stephen and Nicole discovered that I wasn't the financial dependent they thought I was, once they realized that I'd removed myself from their sphere of influence, would they fight for me, or would they simply be relieved that the problem had solved itself? I suspected I already knew the answer. The moving company can pack everything on Tuesday while they're both out, Ruth continued. Nicole has that real estate seminar she's been talking about, and Stephen has his standing appointment with the unemployment office. It felt surreal, planning my escape from my own home like I was fleeing an abusive relationship, which I suppose I was. What about the car loans? Ruth asked. Mr. Morrison filed the paperwork yesterday. Stephen and Nicole have 30 days to either pay off the loans in full or surrender the vehicles. Since I know they don't have $60,000 lying around, I expect I'll be getting 2 cars back very soon. And then what? Then Mr. Morrison will sell them and put the money toward my new life. It was a clean break, financially and emotionally. No gradual transition, no lengthy explanations, no opportunities for Stephen and Nicole to manipulate me into staying or changing my mind. Just a complete severing of the ties that had been strangling me for 3 years. Sunday was the hardest day. I walked through the house, taking mental pictures of the life Richard and I had built together. Our bedroom, where we'd shared 30 years of marriage. The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals for my family. The living room where Stephen had taken his first steps, where we'd opened Christmas presents, where Richard had taught our son to play chess. But those memories belonged to a different family, one that had died gradually over the past 3 years. The people living in this house now were strangers who saw me as an inconvenience to be managed, and I owed them nothing. That evening, I wrote letters, not explanations or justifications, but simple statements of fact. One to Stephen, telling him that I was moving and that he and Nicole had 30 days to find alternative housing. One to Nicole, informing her that her services as my caregiver were no longer needed. One to Mr. Morrison, authorizing him to handle any legal issues that arose from my departure. I also wrote checks, final gifts to the people who had shown me kindness when Stephen and Nicole hadn't been watching. Mrs. Peterson received enough money to replace the old fence between our properties that she'd been worrying about for months. The mailman got a generous tip for all the times he'd taken extra care with my packages. Dr. Williams's office received a donation to their patient assistance fund. Each check was a small act of rebellion against the narrative Nicole had created, that I was a confused old woman who couldn't manage her own affairs. I was managing them just fine. Thank you very much. Monday night, I barely slept. I lay in the guest room that had become my prison, listening to Stephen and Nicole moving around in what used to be my bedroom, making plans for their future that didn't include me, except as a problem to be solved. At one point, I heard Nicole on the phone with someone, probably one of her support group friends from her fabricated caregiver persona. The doctor said she's stable now, but we're looking at memory care facilities, she was saying. It's so hard, but Stephen and I have to think about what's best for everyone. We can't sacrifice our whole lives, sacrifice their whole lives, while living rent-free in my house, eating food I paid for, driving cars I'd unwittingly guaranteed loans for. They saw caring for me as a sacrifice. Tuesday morning, Stephen left for his appointment with the unemployment office, and Nicole departed for her real estate seminar with a cheerful wave and a promise to bring home dinner. They had no idea it was the last time they'd see me in that house. The movers arrived exactly on schedule, professional, efficient, and discreet. They had my entire life packed and loaded within 4 hours. Clothes, books, photographs, the few pieces of furniture that had real sentimental value. Everything else could stay with the house. Ruth followed me in her car as I drove away from the only home Stephen had ever known. I didn't look back. There was nothing behind me worth seeing anymore. The house in Ocean City was small, but perfect. 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a living room with a picture window that looked out over the dunes toward the Atlantic Ocean. For the first time in 3 years, I would fall asleep to the sound of waves, instead of the sound of my son and his girlfriend discussing my inconvenience to their lives. The moving crew had my belongings unpacked and arranged by dinner time. Ruth stayed to help me settle in, and we ordered pizza from a local place that delivered to the beach. We ate on my new back deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. "How do you feel?" Ruth asked as we finished our meal. I considered the question carefully. I felt many things. Sad about the end of my relationship with Stephen, angry about the years I'd lost, relieved to be free from Nicole's manipulations. But underneath all of that was something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I feel like myself again, I said finally. My phone had been buzzing with texts and calls all afternoon, but I hadn't answered any of them. I knew what they would say. Stephen panicking about finding me gone. Nicole spinning the disappearance into another episode of my supposed mental decline. Both of them probably convinced that I was wandering around confused and needed to be rescued. Let them think that, at least for now. Tomorrow, when Mr. Morrison's office opened, they would receive registered letters explaining exactly what had happened and what their options were. They would learn that the confused, dependent old woman they thought they were managing had outsmarted them completely. But tonight, I just wanted to sit on my deck and listen to the ocean and remember what it felt like to be Charlotte Williams again. Not Stephen's burden or Nicole's caregiving project, but a woman who had earned the right to spend her remaining years in peace. The stars came out as Ruth and I finished cleaning up our dinner. Bright, clear stars that I hadn't been able to see from my old house because of the city lights. What happens now? Ruth asked. I thought about the question as I watched the waves roll in and out, eternal and unchanging. Now I live, I said simply. For the first time in 3 years, I just live. 3 months later, I was sitting on my deck with my morning coffee when my phone rang. Stephen's name appeared on the screen for the first time since I'd left. I let it go to voicemail, just like I had with all his previous calls. But this time, curiosity got the better of me. I played the message while watching a pair of pelicans dive for fish just beyond the surf. "Mom, it's me." Stephen's voice sounded strained, tired. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I need you to know that Nicole and I broke up. She moved out last week." There was a long pause. I found some things after she left. Documents, papers. I think I'm starting to understand what really happened. I deleted the message without listening to the rest. The truth was, Stephen's awakening had come far too late to matter. Mr. Morrison had kept me informed about the legal proceedings. Stephen and Nicole had been unable to pay off the car loans, so both vehicles had been repossessed and sold. They'd tried to contest the 30-day eviction notice from my house, but since they'd never had a lease and had been living there as my guests, they had no legal standing. Nicole had disappeared first, probably back to whatever identity she'd worn before she became Stephen's devoted girlfriend and my fictional caregiver. Stephen had struggled alone in my house for 2 months, unable to afford the utilities or maintenance without my subsidies, before finally accepting that he had to move out. According to Mrs. Peterson, who called me weekly with neighborhood updates, Stephen had moved into a small apartment across town and was working at a local hardware store. She said he looked older, defeated, like a man who had finally understood the consequences of his choices. "He asks about you," Mrs. Peterson had told me during our last call. "He wanted to know if I had your new address. I told him that if you wanted him to have it, you would have given it to him yourself." I'd thanked her for that. The distance I'd put between myself and my old life wasn't just geographical. It was emotional protection that I wasn't ready to give up. My new life had settled into a rhythm that felt like breathing after years of holding my breath. I woke each morning to the sound of waves and spent my days exactly as I pleased. I read books without interruption, took long walks on the beach, learned to paint watercolors at the community center. The people I'd met in Ocean City knew me as Charlotte, the widow who'd moved to the coast for her health. They didn't know about Stephen or Nicole or the years I'd spent disappearing in my own home. They saw me as I was now, a woman who volunteered at the animal shelter, who made excellent lemon bars for church potlucks, who could be counted on to help newcomers feel welcome. The financial independence I'd discovered had given me more than security. It had given me choices. I could afford to be generous without being exploited. I could help people without enabling them. I could be kind without being taken advantage of. Last month, I'd received a letter from Dr. Williams's office thanking me for my donation and telling me how many patients it had helped. The week before, Mrs. Peterson had sent photos of her new fence, along with a note expressing gratitude for my unexpected gift. Mike the mailman had used his tip to take his family on their first real vacation in years. Each of these small acts of generosity felt like proof that I was still capable of making a positive difference in the world, that my value wasn't tied to how much abuse I was willing to tolerate from people who claimed to love me. The will Mr. Morrison had prepared remained unchanged. Ruth would inherit the old house if Stephen ever vacated it, along with enough money to maintain it properly. The bulk of my estate would still go to the people who had treated me with genuine kindness, not because they were obligated to or because they wanted something from me, but because they recognized my humanity. For Stephen, there was still just the hospital bill from my heart attack, not as punishment, but as a reminder of the day our relationship had died, the day he'd chosen convenience over compassion, and revealed what I really meant to him. I'd started keeping a journal, something I'd never done before. Writing down my thoughts and experiences felt like reclaiming my story from people who had tried to rewrite it for their own purposes. The entries from my first weeks in Ocean City chronicled the simple joy of making decisions without consulting anyone else, of eating what I wanted when I wanted, of going to bed and waking up on my own schedule. Recent entries were different. They talked about the new friendships I was building, the volunteer work that gave me purpose, the quiet satisfaction of a life lived on my own terms. They talked about healing, about rediscovering who I was beneath years of trying to make myself acceptable to people who were determined to find me lacking. This morning's entry would be about the phone call from Stephen, about the strange absence of feeling I'd experienced when I heard his voice. Once, the sound of my son in distress would have sent me running to help, regardless of the cost to myself. Now it just sounded like someone else's problem, someone I used to know but no longer recognized. Ruth visited every few weeks, and we'd developed a tradition of long walks on the beach followed by dinner at a local seafood restaurant. She'd become the sister I'd forgotten I had during the years when Nicole was systematically cutting me off from everyone who cared about me. "You look good," she'd said during her last visit, studying my face across the restaurant table. "Younger, somehow." "I feel younger," I'd told her, and it was true. The constant stress of walking on eggshells in my own home, of trying to anticipate and prevent Nicole's next criticism or Stephen's next disappointment, had been aging me faster than time itself. Now, at 68, I felt more energetic and optimistic than I had at 65. I was sleeping better, eating better, and for the first time in years, looking forward to the future instead of just enduring the present. The doorbell rang, interrupting my morning reflection. I wasn't expecting anyone, but that wasn't unusual. The mail carrier sometimes needed signatures. Neighbors occasionally dropped by with garden surplus or community news. But when I opened the door, Stephen was standing on my front porch, looking older and more worn than I remembered. He held a small bouquet of flowers and wore an expression of desperate hope that made him look like the little boy he'd been 40 years ago. "Hello, Mom," he said quietly. I stood in the doorway, not inviting him in, not closing the door, just looking at this man who had once been the center of my universe and feeling nothing but a mild curiosity about what had brought him here. "How did you find me?" I asked. "It took a while. I hired a private investigator." He seemed to realize how that sounded and added quickly, "I needed to talk to you, to apologize." "Apologize for what, specifically?" He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other like a child being questioned by a teacher. "For everything. For letting Nicole treat you the way she did. For not seeing what was really happening. For suggesting you should go to a nursing home when you were in the hospital." His voice cracked slightly. "For being a terrible son." I considered his words, waiting to feel something. Anger, forgiveness, sadness, relief. But there was nothing there. Just an empty space where my feelings for Stephen used to be. "Would you like to come in?" I asked, stepping aside. He followed me to the living room, looking around at my small, comfortable space with what seemed like surprise. "This is nice, Mom. Really nice." "Thank you." We sat in chairs facing each other, the coffee table between us like a negotiating surface. Stephen placed the flowers there and launched into what sounded like a prepared speech. "I know you probably hate me, and you have every right to." After Nicole left, I found papers she'd hidden, medical records she'd falsified about your mental state, correspondence with assisted living facilities, even drafts of legal documents trying to get power of attorney over your finances. He ran his hands through his hair. "She was planning to have you declared incompetent, Mom. She was going to take control of everything." I wasn't surprised. Nicole's manipulations had been leading somewhere, and institutional care followed by legal guardianship was the logical conclusion of her strategy. "I also found her real dating profiles," Stephen continued. "She'd been seeing other men for months, telling them she was single and available. She was planning to leave me as soon as she figured out how to access your money. But she never got the chance, I said calmly, because you outsmarted all of us. Stephen looked at me with something that might have been respect. You knew exactly what you were doing when you disappeared, didn't you? I knew I was saving my own life. Stephen flinched at the word choice, but I wasn't going to soften it for his comfort. That's exactly what I'd done. Mom, I want to make this right. I know I can't undo the past 3 years, but I want to try to earn your forgiveness. I looked at my son, this middle-aged man who still thought that wanting something was the same as deserving it. Stephen, I don't hate you, I said finally, but I don't trust you either. And without trust, we don't really have a relationship. Then let me earn your trust back, please. How? The question seemed to stump him. He'd come here with apologies and explanations, but no concrete plan for rebuilding something that had been broken beyond repair. I could visit regularly, call more often, show you that I've changed. Changed how? You're 42 years old, Stephen. You are who you are. People can change. Some people can, but change requires acknowledging what you did wrong, not just what Nicole did wrong. He looked confused, but Nicole was the one who manipulated everything. She lied to both of us. Nicole couldn't have manipulated anything if you hadn't been willing to believe that I was a burden. She couldn't have isolated me if you hadn't already decided that my presence in your life was an inconvenience. Stephen's face reddened. That's not fair. I was trying to take care of you. You were trying to manage me. There's a difference. We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, I could hear the waves rolling in, the sound that had become the soundtrack of my new life. What do you want from me, Stephen? I asked finally. I want my mother back. Your mother is gone. She died when you suggested I belonged in a nursing home while I was having a heart attack. The woman sitting here now is someone who's learned to put herself first. Stephen's eyes filled with tears. Mom, please. I know I screwed up, but you're all the family I have left. Whose fault is that? The harsh truth hung in the air between us. Stephen had lost his first wife through his own poor choices, had alienated his children from his first marriage, had allowed Nicole to drive away everyone who cared about him. Now he was alone and looking to me to fill the void he'd created. But I was done being the solution to other people's problems. I think you should go, I said gently. Stephen's face crumpled. Just like that? You won't even give me a chance? I gave you a chance every day for 3 years. You used it to make me feel like I didn't matter. He sat there for another moment, maybe hoping I'd change my mind, maybe trying to think of something else to say. Finally, he stood up and walked toward the door. I love you, Mom, he said without turning around. I know you do, I replied. But love without respect isn't enough anymore. After he left, I sat on my deck with a fresh cup of coffee and watched the pelicans hunt in the surf. My phone would probably ring again in a few days or weeks, Stephen trying once more to bridge a gap that couldn't be crossed with words alone. But for now, I was content to listen to the waves and feel the sun on my face, and know that the life I'd built here was mine alone. No one could take it from me, change it without my permission, or use it to serve their own purposes. I'd learned something important in my 68 years. Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go, and sometimes the greatest act of self-preservation is refusing to be found. The hospital bill that Stephen would receive in my will wasn't really about the money. It was about remembering the moment when everything became clear, when I realized that I deserved better than what I'd been accepting. And now, sitting in my own home by the sea, I finally had it.